I talked about Richard Garriott in my last video, a very nice man who has turned up on my Twitter in the past. When he released a Calabeth in 1979, it confused the marketplace and almost nobody bought it. Then a company took a chance on this weird new invention and offered him a publication deal. It sold thousands of copies, setting Lord British up to craft the Ultima games that would help shape what we know as the RPG game industry today. In order to create a Calabeth in the first place, Garriott had to split the costs with his father in order to purchase a home Apple II computer. He had been bouncing around school and work computers previously. This was because in today's money an Apple II cost between $5,000 and $11,000. As you can imagine, this was prohibitively expensive for the vast majority of Americans at the time. And that's what I'm going to talk about with you today, the marketplace that these great games existed in. Every single day we exist, there are more games to play than ever before, more games than any single person can complete in their lifetime. I know this because it's going to take me between 20 and 30 years to finish the Random DOS game show, and the galling thing for new titles that emulation has kindly provided is that when competing for a player base, you're not just up against your contemporaries anymore, you're also up against every game ever made. So it stands to reason that the further you go back in time, the less choice you have and the less games there are, right? When a Calabeth came out, it was up against a few popular text-based terminal dungeon crawlers, and eventually ported versions of top-down graphical roguelikes. There wasn't really anything like it on home systems, or otherwise, until Wizardry came out in late 1981, by which point Ultima was already a thing. There were less PC games, the personal computers were far more expensive, and as a result the games were too. Consoles were a lot cheaper, but even their games cost up to £100. I checked a scan of my father's favourite magazine, Personal Computer World, from December of 1980 thanks to World Radio History, and it was selling a backgammon game for the Apple II for £66 in today's money. Discount gaming hadn't appeared yet, and for that people just programmed the game into their machine, line by line. These days you can have a AAA experience for free at the touch of a button, and there are regular discounts on games that bring them below a $5. It's a vastly different marketplace than the one Garriott entered, but a far different type of clientele too. The people these games were aimed at had already spent a large sum of money on their Apple, and there was an expectation of quality if they were going to fork out a further amount for games that they couldn't just code in themselves. So the games had to justify their price tag, as it was much easier to be found out in a small market of a few hundred titles with more discerning customers. They would only buy a few games as opposed to having a backlog of hundreds of games like today. So the replayability had to be high and/or the concept memorable. Sports games, roguelikes, board games, and arcade ports all offered near infinite replayability. So your game either needed to offer a short but transcendent experience, like Mystery House did, or provide the player with enough content to feel like they had their money's worth, even when you knew what you were doing. The likes of a Calabeth and Wizardry took between 12 and 40 hours to complete, and players would often take much longer to explore everything their respective worlds had to offer. And as the technology improved, so did the scope of these games. Ultima 4 can take you up to 70 hours to complete, and Wizardry 4 and Might and Magic weren't far off that mark either, driven by the expectation of the 80s market to justify their heavy price tags. With PC games costing less than ever before with the advent of Steam sales, the early 2010s were the beginning of a devaluation of both gaming and the player's time, allowing them to accrue the aforementioned backlogs. It was a change in mindset thanks to the enormous availability of games. It didn't matter if you didn't immediately click with a game, because you only spent £1 on it, so you just moved on to the next one. The games became more disposable, and their treatment of a player's time became more disposable too, because they had an audience of millions now instead of a handful of wealthy or privileged hobbyists. Rather than offering a unified package that was fully tested, with their reputation staked upon it, these developers use early players as glorified beta testers for the piecemeal content they provide, then offer more via additional DLC that doesn't necessarily improve the already limited contents of the base game. In the days of Lord British, there were no second chances. While his Ultima games may have been ported and remade many times, in order for them to be the smash hits they are, he needed to program them correctly the first time around, and that required a Calibeth and over 20 other RPGs for earlier systems. So while the ever-evolving game as a result of patches and additional content can result in things turning around for the developer and the product, it also allows for lazy developers, scams, and broken promises. Likewise, history is littered with games that came out broken and never got their flowers until much later, when the community went out of their way to fix them. Contrarians would argue that the lens of history only examines the games from the past that were successful and beloved, and that there were plenty of terrible games made back then too. The answer to that is for another channel to devote their time to. I can speak for DOS though, and say that the majority of titles I've come across are competently programmed at worst, and utterly timeless at best. The idea that the vast bulk of games created were terrible is something I expected going in, but quite frankly, it hasn't been like that. Much like the time period in which these games were created, the marketplace in which they were sold is also never coming back again, and it's yet another reason why these older and more complete games are better in general than their newer counterparts.